Welcome to the third dimension. Israel, for the first time, attacked the port of Hodeidah in Yemen on Saturday in response to a claimed Houthi drone strike in Tel Aviv. 6 people were killed and 80 others were wounded. The Israeli military claimed that it hit military targets, but the UN mission in Hodeidah reported that the strikes did extensive damage to oil facilities, fuel tanks and the port's wharf and cranes, all of which are critical to supplying the civilian population with much needed fuel and food. The Israeli attack represents a major escalation against the Houthis, who have been launching drones and missiles at Israeli targets without success since shortly after the war in Gaza began. Observers warn that the Israeli strikes will play into the hands of the Houthis, as direct conflict with the US and Israel is a significant boost for the Houthis' domestic political standing, and their opposition to the war in Gaza has also raised their international profile. To discuss this topic joins me Mr. Fernando Carvajal. Fernando Carvajal is a United Nations former expert in Yemen. Fernando, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Doctor.
Okay. Now, Israel, for the first time, attacked Hodeidah port on Saturday, Fernando. In fact, this marks the first attack throughout the Arab-Israeli conflict on Yemen. Okay? The United Nations Security Council held a special meeting last night on the Houthi claimed drone attack on Tel Aviv and also on the Hodeidah port. Okay? During that meeting, UN officials raised concerns on this major regional escalation, saying, one rash move, one miscalculation could trigger a catastrophe that goes far beyond the borders and, frankly, beyond imagination. Do you share the same concerns?
Definitely on the escalation part, but I do like to begin by reminding your audience that this isn't the first time that, according to the Houthis, this is not the first time that the Israelis have attacked Yemen. Remember that in 2015, Houthis claimed that Israel was behind the strike on Nukum mountain in Sana'a.
Yeah.
So this adds to the way that the Houthis perceive the conflict. With regards to the specific strike on Hodeidah,
yes,
you're absolutely right. This adds to the optics of a potential wider conflict in the region. It adds to the potential to the optics of an escalating conflict in the region, extending from the war in Gaza, not extending itself from the war in Yemen, the civil war that continues in Yemen since March 2015.
Okay. Now, let me bring in Nick Brumfield, the Yemen researcher, commenting on this Israeli attack. He said, Fernando, the Israeli attack on Hodeidah's oil storage was not an example of the Houthis hiding weapons in civilian infrastructure and it getting bombed. This is, according to him, this is Israel purposefully targeting vital civilian infrastructure in and out of itself. In fact, with this, Fernando, the New York Times just 2 days ago, they published a very long article saying that the Israeli attack on Hodeidah will harm civilians, not the Houthis. How would you react?
With all due respect, with our friend Nick, I believe, from a military perspective, during your intro, you hit the nail on the head. The Houthis use these facilities for military purposes. So this strike by the IDF on Hodeidah, in their view, from their perspective, was a legitimate military target because Houthis utilized the port to import weapons components, drones, missiles components. Today, on Tuesday morning, we heard the briefing to the UN Security Council that the UK ambassador to the UN continues to express concern over smuggling of weapons through on ships that are not inspected by UNVIM in Djibouti. Second, Houthis use Hodeidah coastline, the Red Sea coastline, and Tehama to launch the drones, the drone boats and UAVs toward civilian ships and naval ships along the Red Sea.
Yeah.
Lastly, this particular issue on the fuel depot, in Hodeidah, that is where the Houthis store the fuel for their missiles and drones and drone boats, unfortunately, within vicinity of civilian residential areas. That is where we must focus, I believe, on the Houthi crimes of continue to export their war effort, whether it's against Israel, Saudi Arabia, the US, the international community, from civilian areas. There are known areas in Hodeidah where Houthis store fuel, whether it's jet fuel or regular fuel for cars, in civilian neighborhoods throughout Hodeidah. Now, that does not excuse the specifically targeting of the crane, for example.
Yes.
This was a big message. I think I mentioned this to you in a message, in a text message. This was a big message to the Houthis when they hit the crane. This was the only large crane that had survived since 2015 at the start of the war.
Yeah.
This was very significant for the import of goods, as you pointed out.
Yes.
And it will definitely hurt the flow of humanitarian assistance and commercial goods into northern Yemen.
Yeah, and maybe I may remind you, Fernando, that since the UK and US strikes started in January, both countries and their allies have refrained from attacking Hodeidah's port, but Israel did.
Absolutely. We know that there have been a number of airstrikes by the US and the UK within the city of Hodeidah. We saw the radio station that was hit, specifically that radio station, which was used by the Houthis for military communications. This was not a civilian radio station, as the UN and others have claimed. The civilian radio station was moved months ago, maybe even over a year ago, to a different building, and that the building for the radio station was utilized for military purposes by the Houthis because it had the telecommunications infrastructure that the Houthis needed for military operations. But yes, you're right. The U.S. and the British Air Forces, considering international law, considering the impact on the humanitarian crisis, refrain from targeting the crane and the port facilities, I fully agree, which were brought up today, on Tuesday, by the UK ambassador as being a point of entry for continued smuggled weapons.
Okay. Now, let us move to another point, within the debate of this Israeli attack on Hodeidah. Another Yemen observer said, Fernando, that the Israeli strike is a gift to the Houthis for a group whose existence, evolution and expansion depends on being at war. They are being gifted everything they need. And in fact, you must have followed Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the Houthi leader, commenting on that strike, saying that we are happy with this confrontation with Israel. How would you comment?
Unfortunately, it's absolutely right. And unfortunately, it shows the level of the Houthi crimes where they don't care about the Yemeni population. As long as they sustain that permanent state of revolution, that permanent war against external enemies, the crimes committed by the Israeli Air Force against civilians in this strike in Hodeidah are definitely a gift to the Houthis and the progressives that are against the Israeli government and the war in Gaza, because it adds to the crimes, the optics of the crimes committed by the Israeli government and the Israeli military. But at the same time, the Houthis capitalized this at the expense of the Yemeni population. They invited this strike by claiming the drone strike on Tel Aviv. Again, the Houthis, as you mentioned in the intro, since November, they have claimed to have launched a dozen missiles toward Eilat port in Israel and threatening to strike Tel Aviv since late December. It's still, evidence shows that it's mostly Iraqi militia who are launching the missiles and drones to the port, and Hezbollah launching drones and missiles to Tel Aviv and settlements in northern Israel. But it is the Houthis who invited this strike, this crime against Yemeni civilians. And I believe that in the Yemeni context, we must keep focus on the crimes being committed by the Houthis. In the international sphere, from an international perspective, definitely we need to take into consideration that Israel is willing to commit crimes far beyond their boundaries, their national boundaries.
Okay. Now, other observers, Fernando, they discussed what we call the possible reaction of the Houthis, and some of them said it's likely for the Houthis to respond to the attack with further attacks on Israel and potentially on US allies in the Gulf. The question is, to what extent does that seem possible?
It is very possible. It is highly probable that in the coming weeks we are going to see an escalation claimed by the Houthis. I want to be specific. Claimed by the Do the Houthis have the capability to directly escalate the conflict? I doubt it at this time. The Houthis escalating the conflict with Israel, where they're launching missiles, drones toward Israeli territory, would mean that, number one, they would use Saudi airspace for those drones and missiles, which is highly unlikely that the Saudis would allow a drone or missile to fly over to Najran to begin with. Two, it would imply the missile or drone traveling through the Red Sea, which is unlikely that the U.S. Theodore Roosevelt Navy ship will allow that, the group will allow that to happen. Third, it is highly, the Houthi social media sphere claim that the drone that hit Tel Aviv traveled from northern Yemen over the Red Sea into Sudan, through Libya, into the Mediterranean, to Tel Aviv. That's well over 2,000 kilometers. Again, the capabilities remain in question, but their cooperation. And if we notice on Houthi social media and their propaganda campaigns recently, they've pushed over the last 3 weeks, they've pushed in public the relationship with Iraqi militia, the partnership with the Iraqi militia, the cooperation with the Iraqi militia. And a lot of observers are fueling that campaign to prop up the Houthis, which helps the Houthis in their profile, as you mentioned in the intro, in their profile within the Iranian axis of resistance. They are being the face of the axis of resistance at the moment. So when we look at Houthi capabilities and the way that they're willing and able to escalate this conflict, whether it's the U.S., regional neighbors, or the U.S., is the engagement of terrorist operations beyond targeting civilian vessels, which is a concern of the Europeans and the U.S., that this escalation will lead to terrorist attacks in European countries or the U.S. That is one of the major concerns at the moment for the West.
Okay. Okay, this brings us also to the U.S., Fernando, and as you have raised it now, the U.S., the Houthi Red Sea attacks can escalate and go further even to Europe. Now, The question is, Fernando, the United States has kept what we call the understanding that Houthis are not doing this for the sake of Palestinians in Gaza. But now, as Israel started attacking Houthis, this kind of US narrative, okay, has, I would say, become a kind of not convincing. Yes?
Unfortunately, you're correct. This, again, hands it over to the Houthis and their propaganda, because now the U.S. administration can't decouple the war in Yemen, the escalation by the Houthis, the crimes committed by the Houthis, and the war in Gaza.
Yeah.
The Houthis claiming that drone strike in Tel Aviv, successful drone strike in Tel Aviv, and having the Israelis walk into that and retaliate in the way that they did, it leaves President Biden with his back against the wall, because he can no longer engage a narrative decoupling the conflict. This is what's wrong. Also, as we speak, we know that the U.S. envoy Tim Linderkin was just returned to the U.S. from his trip to the Gulf to visit Muscat and Riyadh and other neighboring Gulf countries, where we see that we didn't really get much from his visit, from his shuttle diplomacy this month in July. We did see that the UN envoy was present physically in person in New York during his UN briefing, but we haven't heard much from the US envoy. And this is concerning to us US observers of Yemeni affairs, because it tells us that as President Biden is about to leave office, keep in mind that it was President Biden who appointed Tim Linderkin as soon as he took office. So for the 4 years of President Biden's special envoy to Yemen, we have seen no significant advantage of that, from that position, from that role by a U.S. diplomat. And this, again, allows the critics of U.S. policy to dig in deeper and criticize the U.S. for their failure to deal with the war in Yemen. And as we speak, I believe the envoy's team arrived back in Washington, and we have to see another week or so to figure out what their briefings were like. Now, again, as we speak also, Fernando,
the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is also in Washington, D.C., and he is expected to meet Biden perhaps by Thursday. Now, some observers say after Biden's withdrawal from the race, he is expected to focus more on foreign policy, exactly as Clinton did in his last days. My question is, what message should Biden deliver to Benjamin Netanyahu when meeting in Washington? In terms of escalation in the Middle East, my point is.
Unfortunately, with President Biden stepping down from the campaign, he's a lame duck president now. The focus goes to the relationship between Netanyahu and the two current candidates, which is Vice President Harris and former President Trump. So we saw this morning and last night, Monday night and Tuesday morning, we saw that President Biden made statements regarding Israel and the war in Gaza. And again, there were a continuation of what we've heard over the last month since the president came out with his plan for the prisoner exchange. Unfortunately, I don't see a change in the relationship between President Biden and Netanyahu. Unfortunately, we now see Netanyahu, the leverage with strengthening, the momentum strengthening with Netanyahu and his hardline policies and his hardline approach to the war in Gaza, because now Netanyahu doesn't have to take President Biden into consideration, unfortunately. He has to focus on Vice President Harris, lobby her for a stronger, closer friendship, less criticism. We have to admit that President Biden has been a staunch critic of Netanyahu directly, personally, directly of Netanyahu. So now what we can expect is Netanyahu using this visit this week to focus on his relationship with Vice President Harris, her potential candidate for vice president, and possibly we might see a meeting with Trump and his vice presidential candidate.
Yeah.
So Yemen once again goes to the bottom of the pile, where it is not a priority for President Biden at the moment.
Okay, so a final point to wrap up, Fernando. Okay, amid all these developments, especially the Israeli attack on Hodeidah, so how do you see now the prospects of peace in Yemen within this kind of, I would say, concerns about a wider war in the region?
Tuesday morning, Houthis were handed yet another victory when the deal was struck over the banks in Sana'a and the reversal of the Aden CBY decree against the banks.
Yeah.
The deal to expand economic cooperation between the Political Leadership Council and the Houthis in Sana'a has definitely delivered a new victory to the Houthis. So as you mentioned, they have the propaganda victory with the Israeli strike at Hodeidah. Then on Tuesday morning, they were handed an economic victory with this deal. There is still no deal on the prisoner exchange. And on Monday night, the Houthis made an announcement that they're cracking down further on UN and NGOs operating in their territory. So this is merely the continuation of the cycle of insanity, doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. The Houthis know that they can get what they want with the simple turn on the switch. The more ships they attack, the more they're going to get. The immediate result of this deal is an extension of the Houthi-Saudi détente from October 2022. This means that the Houthis and the Saudis are going to continue their commitment to no cross-border strikes in the coming months. On the ground in Yemen, we already know that the Houthis are trying to escalate in Taiz. Even though they opened the Hawban road, they're escalating in other regions around the city of Taiz. We see the fighting in Adala. We see the threats in Madrid. So on the ground in Yemen, we can expect the Houthis to be emboldened. We can expect them to mobilize more troops along the front, and we can expect a resurgence of clashes along multiple fronts. The war between the Houthis and Saudi will continue in the détente until the next 60 to 90 days, until there can be more negotiations on a different type of peace agreement between the Houthis and the Political Leadership Council. The Houthis, again, I suspect they will continue to claim strikes on Israel that are directly perpetrated by Iraqi militias and Hezbollah, who have capabilities to escalate that particular front.
Okay. With this grim scene about the regional and domestic political scene in Yemen and in the region, we come to the end of this show. Fernando, thank you so much again for talking to Yemen Today TV, and thank you for your time and insights.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
That's all for this time. See you next week with a new edition of The Third Dimension.